Hello, GTD Connect members. It's John Forrester here with Meg Edwards and Julie Ireland.
Hey everybody, how are you? So glad to be here.
Hi everyone. Nice to see everyone.
Well, we're here for the What If I Need It Syndrome webinar. This came from an idea that I think Julie started, where we were talking about what shows up in coachings that she does, and she said she's frequently getting people who say, I know maybe I shouldn't keep this, but what if I need it? And so we decided to develop that into a webinar. So that's what we're here for, and great to see all of you GTD Connect members on the line. We've got quite a crew here. So Julie, Meg, anything else you'd like to say to get started here before we go on?
Well, I will just jump in and just say I'm really, really excited about this. John and I, we have these great conversations about, what's really going to serve the Connect members. And, I love, John, you always drive the question to, well, what shows up in coaching? Because in coaching, it's where all this kind of juicy nuance, I think, tends to show up. One of the themes that's been really showing up regularly in coaching is this, what if I need it? And I really see how that, it starts to really impact the clarifying and the organizing around, what if I need it? Clients are getting stuck. It's kind of like getting like kind of deer in the headlights, kind of paralyzed around that part of the 5 steps. And so I thought it would be really fun to just really unpack that a little bit and look at kind of where the different, Meg and I are talking about the different areas and where that tends to show up, kind of the different themes. So that's really what we're going to be doing today. And, please feel free to, jump in, ask questions, and we're just going to have fun and hopefully provide lots of value.
Sounds
Meg, anything?
Good. Yeah, I think just to add to it, one of the things I think is so interesting is that how getting things done is really about having that external trusted system and really having that fundamental thought process. And I think sometimes as coaches, people turn to us like we have the answers. Well, what if I need this, or should I keep it? I get that a lot. Like, they'll pick up this and they'll say, should I keep it? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, what is it? And you got to go through kind of all those questions to really kind of unpack it. And each thing that you pick up is stuff, and you have to kind of transform that stuff. And I thought that what we would do is a much more deeper dive on 3 areas that we find that people kind of still have some opportunities to really make their thinking more crisp. And I see a lot of times in coaching, we don't see stuff that people get done. We don't see all the emails that people have done or the files. We see the stuff that still has not been decided upon, and they don't know what to do with it, and they haven't finished the thinking. So these guys pick kind of 3 areas that we want to take just a deeper dive on to get all you GTD Connect members to think a little bit more. Am I got some drag in these areas? Remember, one of the things we talk about is GTD really helps alleviate that drag. So I want you guys to really sit back and do some real reflecting. We're going to create some space for all of you to really think about these areas and where your opportunity for improvement is.
Great. Yeah, we've got 3 example areas, and for each one, we have the quote from David Allen that applies to it, and thanks to Kelly Forrester for putting together the slide deck and the quotes from David for this. So let's dive in with example 1. This would be your to-read piles, lists, and folders. And here's our quote from David. It's critical the read review pile be reserved only for those longer than 2-minute things that you actually want to read when you have time. The question we came up with for that is, are you overcommitting on your reading?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I really feel like Meg and I, we could do a full webinar on each of these themes. Reading, over the years between our collective experience, like how many times we've really seen these kind of giant to read stacks, and really, the question is, am I really committed to reading this, or is it something that maybe I might like to read or I might want to read? And it really, I mean, I've said this before, I have clients that could take an entire 6-month sabbatical from their work to just catch up on reading. And, one of the things that kind of was driving this for me is like I was watching this play out. It's like, well, I really need to read this. Like it shows up so much. Julie, you don't understand. I have to read this. And we kind of slow things down a little bit in the coaching. It's like, well, is it really a have to read? Do you really have to read it? Or is it more like, is it maybe more reference where you might need to just come back to it later? Or is it more just like, something of interest that might be on a someday maybe? And, for me, when I have something I have to read and it's a really clear commitment, it goes on my action list and I actually write critical read on there. So it's like a cue for me. It's like I've made that. And it's so funny. Can you just go back to the quote for a second,
Sure.
John? Because, not that I would ever like want to, criticize David Allen's quotes, but I would say, this around want to read, to me, I would just change that a little bit to like have to read, or I'm really committed to read, because I think the want to read is where people tend to get stuck. People want to read a lot of things, and all this stuff is coming at them, and they want to read it, but it's like, it's like, do I really have to read it? Meg, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and when you guys, one of the things I love about you Connect members is your interaction with the question box. So I'd love you to put in the question box the answer to, are you overcommitting on your reading, yes or no? And I'd love to just see what people have to say, because I have never, in all my years coaching, I have never met anybody that was on top of their reading.
Wow.
I was really kind of thinking about it, and I thought, when I talk about presenting issues and I talk about, well, what do you want to see different than currently is, inevitably there is a real heart-to-heart conversation about the mix-match commitment to reading. And that in some ways, particularly when they create an email folder. So like how many of you GTD Connect members have an email folder called Read and Review? And that, frankly, is like, like you're going through, you're clarifying your emails, and you're like, yep, I got to read that. Yep, I got to read that. Yep, I got to read that. And now you just have a reshuffled inbox again, just like that action folder for a lot of people is just a reshuffled inbox. Same with Read and Review. It's a bunch of stuff. And I think that again, you've got to really take a pause and just ask yourself some more questions. And of course, David doesn't necessarily talk about those prompting questions when you're going through the workflow diagram and saying, okay, what is it? Well, it's an article from a colleague on innovation. Okay, is it actionable? Yeah, I want to read it. Boom, it goes in the read and review file. Or for maybe some of you, it goes into the read and review folder. And then it's just a bunch of stuff. And then I come in and coach people, or I do virtual coaching with people, and it's like, okay, let's take a look at it. And so then we have like kind of more of a deeper dive conversation that's like, okay, so it's kind of like what Julie said, I want versus I have to. And I find that there needs to be this conversation about, well, how much time do you want to be devoting to reading, professional development? And get kind of clear on that. If you really only have a couple of hours a month for reading, and yet you got this huge stack of read and review, you can't do all of that read and review. So I, for example, have several different read and review folders or different ways of putting read and review. I, frankly, if it's not high target value, I'm not going to read it. So I'm really ruthless when that reading comes at me. And David particularly loves to send a lot of stuff to us about, reading. And I actually have an email folder called Read and Learn. Because if I don't want to learn about it, I'm not going to frankly read it. And if it's just reference, like if David sent something on, I don't know, like innovation, I might say, okay, well, I don't need to know about it right now. It's not high target value for me. I'm just going to create a folder called innovation, and I'm going to file it away. So if I ever need it, or if I have a client that asks about it, I can retrieve that information. So I'll just do the 2-minute rule, scan it, say, yeah, this is pretty cool. And usually when something comes from David, I don't really have to scan if it's valuable or not. I pretty much know that. And then I'll file it away so I can come back. If I want to learn it, I will stick it into my Read and Learn folder. And I actually have time during the month that I schedule for Read and Learning. It's professional development for me. So I actually create the space that makes that valuable so that when I have some time carved out, I go to my Read and Learn, and it's like, oh, what are these cool options that I want to do? And then I'll pick from it, and I'll use that time. And then I have just kind of that little FYI, I'll take on a plane. You can just create a folder, and I actually date it. And if I haven't read this sucker within a month, it's gone.
That's exactly what I was about to ask you about. When you're dealing with clients around this, do you find that they have to read piles or folders that there's something in there that's been in there for 6 months, a year, and it should have been processed, and it should have been done by now?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the it's one of those things where sometimes on the front end, it's a read, but then at some point, what's the commitment? I mean, if that's part of the weekly review, right? To go back through this stuff once a week and just keep, reassessing, recommitting, or maybe recalibrating. But I mean, today, in this day and age, I would guess if something's 6 months, a year old, if you haven't read it in 6 months, probably it's either, it just needs to be tossed, or, then at that point it becomes reference.
Yeah, you guys in the GTD Connect question box, yes, 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 with exclamations, always. Yes, I overcommit. Yeah, but you know what? I think people aren't even aware of it until that's why we're having this conversation. Like, oh my goodness, like you go numb to it. And I actually, behind me, I have books that I read, and I actually have them divided into different ways. Some are just reference. Some are books I'm actually going to read. I mean, I haven't read them yet, and they're just kind of queued up. And then some are actually like a someday maybe. And then, frankly, the rest of them are, for me, all in my basement. So I actually have to divide my read and review on my bookshelf, because I walk by it and I'm like, oh, yeah, I got to read that. Or, oh, yeah, I haven't read that yet. And then I feel guilty every time I walk by my bookcase. And so for me, it really kind of calmed it down, which is like, yeah, this is just reference. Yeah, these are queued up that I'm going to read. And so I want all of you guys to really think about, what do you need to do to make all of this alive and vibrant? This is really a very functional bookcase for me.
Boy, I just heard a couple of things that are keys for me in what you just said. One of them is about both of you mentioned how long people keep things on these lists. If it's been there a long time, that's something to note. The other thing is, if I look at it and I feel guilty about it, that tells me there's something where it's not organized in the right place. It should be referenced so I can drop the guilt, or it should be critical read so that I don't feel guilty about it. I just get to it and do it.
Yeah, it's really about the agreements, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's like, my kind of wish for myself and everyone is like to have a healthy relationship to the agreements that we're making around reading. And, one of the things I've found is just because something's coming at me, like we get a lot more information now than we used to. And it comes to me and it's like, oh my God, I really should read this, versus like part of what the original, impetus for this was around, I was thinking about, back in the day where, we had like the library. Remember the library? It's like if I needed information, I was really resourceful and I'd go find it. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, everyone's getting information, and it's because it's coming to us, we think we should engage somehow. Mm. And so it's really kind of getting in that front of that and being more in control about like my understanding. That's like, what is it that do I really need to read this? Is this really like have a purpose, or am I just kind of being a bit more reactive just because it came into one of my inboxes?
Dave has a great question. He says, what about personal material, things that have been there for a year, all those magazines you thought you'd read? I'm not a big reader, so this is always a very interesting topic. So I've gotten really clear over the years that when I subscribe to magazines, I actually want to read them. So I actually got rid of a lot of the magazines. It kind of saved me some nice money, but it also was like, you know what? I'm not going to read those magazines anymore. Maybe I read them for a while and maybe I don't. So I have just the magazines that I really want to use. Like, for example, I read the New York Times. If it's not, some people will keep it for the week and then get rid of it. Some people like to keep it. Some people, it's gone at the end of the day. My daughter is a voracious reader. My daughter, Annie, subscribes to about 15 magazines, and she reads 15 magazines. Mm-hmm. And she just has a stack by her, and she's just always going through them, and she combs through them, and then we get rid of them, and we donate them. Yeah. And so part of it is about really managing it. And again, you guys, think about the best practices and not rules. What I love about GTD is it's not about rules, it's about best practices. And the best practices is that you're managing your commitments. And if you have a commitment that you have to read something cover to cover, then you've got to find the time to do that. If it's just because it's a really nice thing to have on your tabletop, you know, that you like it for people to come over. And I live in Maine, and there's these wonderful Maine magazines. There's Down East magazine, and there's these sailing magazines, and there's these Maine home and design magazines. And so I actually like to have some of them out for guests. And I sometimes will read them, and sometimes I won't, and that's no big deal. So get really clear, like take a look at that magazine and say, you know, what is this, and what's my relationship to it, and am I managing my agreements? And you'll answer your questions, and you probably, after this conversation with just even this one of the three topics we're talking about, probably have some actions to capture to be able to say, wait a minute, I can up my game with how I'm managing my read-in piles and lists and folders.
And I wanted to say one other thing about that, which is that, you know, my invitation is to also be mindful about, like, what I tend to see is people tend to hide stuff, you know, so they'll have like a stack of like physical reading, maybe multiple stacks. It's like, here are the periodicals and the books somewhere, and then there's an email read and review folder, and then there's, you know, a read and review context. And so it's like on some level, like we get really unconscious about what that volume is because it's in all these different places. So, you know, the invitation too is to like really try to keep it as much as you can in one place, so that it's like, do I have 58 things that I'm committed to reading or 158? If they're kind of dispersed in different places, it makes it a little harder. Like, it makes it easier to kind of hide, but also harder to assess, like, what really, you know, what's on my plate here in terms of what my commitments are with my reading.
That's helpful. Anything else from either of you about this example before we move on?
Just one thing. I had this client, it was really fascinating, and he had a home office over his garage. He had lots of space in this home office, and he had this credenza, or he had like this low bookshelf behind his desk. And he had this huge read and review stack. It was really almost like it was leaning up against his desk, and he wasn't getting to it. And what he decided is he wanted to separate it into piles. So what Julie said, and it's the same with actions lists, you want to have many, you know, you want to have as many lists as you need, but not too many. It's the same with read and review. But this guy actually divided his read and review stacks into 12 different topics. So that when he went to fly fishing, when he thought I wanted to read fly fishing, he didn't want to go through and schlep through all of those periodicals. He didn't want to have it mixed up with, you know, professional journals and catalogs and things like that. He actually wanted it separated, and that really worked for him. And I have never to this day had somebody have 12 read and review stacks, and it worked for him. And when I did my follow-up call with him, it was working. Wow. Like, he actually wanted to read all of that, but he didn't have the right format to be able to retrieve the information when he wanted to read about fly fishing. So it's kind of a very interesting, wonderful way to be able to play around with the organization of it to make it work for you, because everybody's really different.
Yeah, sounds like just a matter of how it's organized, how it's named, can make it more inviting. Okay, well, we'll move on to our next one, which is reference. And here's the quote for that. Using an effectively simple and easily accessible general reference filing system gives you the freedom to keep as much information as you want. Are you parking anything in action that really belongs in reference?
Again, please put in the question box the answer to that, because it's really helpful for us to know where you guys all sit with it, so we can share things of our experiences. So, Julie?
And I also have the same question for you as on the last one, which is when you're working with people, do you find that if an item sits on an action list too long, that's a clue that maybe it's one of those that leaked over, should have been in reference, but is in action instead? So, Julie, jump right in there.
Well, it's a theme. Like, what if I need it? What if I need it? Oh, what if I need it? It shows up, and I'm a pretty, like, I have a healthy relationship to self-preservation. So, like, if I think I might need something, I store it, and I'm really fine with that as long as I have the space for it and I can access it later when I need it. But oftentimes we kind of get tripped up in terms of, like, what if I need it kind of turns into, we're on reference, it kind of turns around into, like, I don't really trust my reference system, so I'm going to put it on my action list. Or I don't, what I'm really, seeing show so much in coaching now is because we have these great places to store things. It shows up like, well, Julie, should I put it in Dropbox or should I put it in, Box.com or, Evernote or in an email folder, and it kind of starts this, like, fear, kind of like this, like, fear of missing out kind of thing, or fear of, like, what if I can't find it? And, it gets a little tricky. So I just, wanted to kind of, really see if we can kind of unpack this and really help people kind of have a healthy relationship to their reference and being able to store something easily when they need to be able to access it later when they need it without kind of getting that, like, fear caught up in the processing or the clarifying stage.
Fear of missing out, the FOMO.
FOMO. I heard about that recently from a musician. I hadn't heard that before. Meg, do you want to chime in?
Well, I think that there are still, and I don't know, because this is to not necessarily new folks, but GTD members who have wonderful access to the webinars and articles, there's a real, I think, still myth that you get one reference system. I still see that. We talk about a general reference, A through Z. Well, again, you have to have as many as you need, and you don't want to have too many. And I'm still kind of the person that I'm not somebody who scans and then puts it somewhere. I have a tendency to still keep hard copy. I just kind of like it. And I think everybody's really different from that. So I'm a little bit more of, I don't know, was it Kelly? I don't know. Who's the person that really started this whole be kind to your future self? And I think people don't necessarily really think about, well, how do I want to retrieve this information? Because sometimes, frankly, it's easier retrieving it in paper than scanning it, and sometimes vice versa. And I think that also people don't necessarily know the tool well enough, and so that it's not making it easy and elegant to be able to take something, store it, and be able to retrieve it. And I see people, it's too complicated. And, this is really still about the ground level, the runway. And I always say that, every airport in the world is flat, straight, and nothing's on it. Italy didn't get creative and say, let's put the runway on the top of a mountain
with
and let
curves.
the plane take off from there, right, with curves. And I see this more than anything with references. It's like it's all over the place. And they've made it too complicated. And sometimes I think the more techie you are, the more complicated you made your reference. And because I'm not techie, it's pretty simple for me. And either things are kind of in Word documents, or they might be in Mind Manager, mind mapping software, or Evernote, or paper-based reference. So
I love that runway analogy to it, because you don't go to an airport and find them leaving equipment out on the runway just because they might need it later.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, and then it's like the whole thing again about, I'm in Maine, I have a Subaru, so it's kind of like if I have a piece of paper about the Subaru, I just had some work done on it, well, where do I put it under? Is it under car, automobile, or Subaru? And it's like that's where people also get really tripped up, is the naming of it. Well, but maybe I need it under car, and maybe under, automobile. And it's like, this is where you got to really dumb it down, and this is where you guys are. I find people make it way too complicated. And it's like, no, I'm going to think about it being called Subaru, and that's how I'm going to find it when I need it. But I also have like a folder for Subaru, which is just the title, because I don't want to schlep through all the other Subaru stuff if I need the title. So again, it's about being kind to my future self. And if I can find it online, I'm not going to keep it. And I think as workflow coaches, I think one of the things that we are kind of different than maybe for some other professionals, which is toss it, get rid of it. And I'm like, you know what? If in doubt, keep it. But boy, you guys, are you doing your reviews? You know, are you doing your cleaning up? Are you cleaning up every 6 months or a year? Or for me, I know that the minute I print something out, and then if there's any resistance to file it away because it's overstuffed, remember we talk about not having anything overstuffed, or if you put something in Evernote or whatever you're using and you kind of feel like you have to clean it up before you put it someplace, that should be a cue to be able to block out some time and clean it up, because just like runways in Maine, it snows and you got to spend the time plowing, and if you don't plow, then it's going to get muckety muck. And I find that I do not find people unhooking to clean up their reference because they don't have time, because it's a waste. And I'm like, you know what? It really isn't. You got to do your due diligence.
Yeah, reference needs to be really, it's an alive thing. It's not like this kind of dead zone. And I really love what you're sharing, Meg. It's so funny because I have a little, not to talk about rules, but best practices. I love that. I don't think I've ever heard you say that before. Well, I'm just a fan for myself of, like, you know, going through my files, electronic and physical, twice a year. And it's so funny because normally I do it around the 4th of July, and then I do it around like the holidays, around December. And I didn't do it this year. And I did my weekly review over the weekend, and I was like, I can feel it. It's like it's kind of sticky in there. Like there's old stuff in there. There's kind of, it's like drag on my system. Some of the files are too full. I'm having a resistance to filing it. So there's my there's my next action, which is to block off some time to do it. And I love Dave Madison has a great question. There's something about parking it in the action that addresses my fear that I will never run across it again. Does that make sense? Yeah, I really love that, Dave. I wonder, you know, if you maybe either breathed more life into your reference and you did kind of cull it or clean it out periodically, you'd have maybe a better more alive relationship to it. Or I wonder if we'll address this more later, but the someday maybe. Like, to me, like having a someday maybe to park something that's not actionable now, but I might want to look at, and I'm reviewing that list periodically, there's a big safety net there. So, yeah, it sounds like to me, like if you don't trust something, you know, probably you're not looking at it periodically, or you don't have a tickler set up or something where, you know, you don't have a mechanism built in to put it in front of you when you need to. So now your brain's hanging on to it.
Yes, and I think it also goes back to I'm actually standing, so I have a stand-up desk, and then I have 2 drawers and 2 drawers on either side of me, and so those are my general reference, and I find that most people are needing about 4 drawers, so that's within arm's reach. And I tried, as much as I am as a mover, I remember like years ago I thought, well, because I like to move and I had cordless headsets, I'll keep my filing away from me, so I'll go back and forth and file, and that just so didn't work. Like the stack, you know, got created.
You moved your filing cabinets further away from you so you would kind of have a reason to get up and move?
Exactly. So that when I was clarifying emails, and it's like, oh yeah, you know, here, and then it's got to go over here into my filing. I was like moving, and it didn't last. So it's an opportunity, again, that you want to have a very simple and elegant system, but you want things close by. So my filing is really close by. It doesn't mean that I don't see in some people's offices a credenza that might be a little bit further away, that, you know, they don't need it as often, or it's kind of like they're not in it periodically. But you really want to have an active reference. And so, you know, unless you're doing a whole lot of scanning, I still find people need about 4 drawers. I don't necessarily advocate going out and buying stuff yet, but if it shows up, you know, I find that still most people have about 4 drawers. And then you have things that are archived. Like I keep my taxes. I keep a couple of years of taxes here, but then the rest of my taxes are stored. You know, for me, I can store it in my basement, or some people, offices, they'll store it off-site, or they have another place to be able to store it. Or if they can't, it doesn't have to be within arm's reach. You know, it's kind of across the room for them to be able to store it. So, and you need to have enough go ahead, John.
Well, I was just thinking, I'm curious whether any of the Connect members who are on the webinar now have anything to say about whether they tend to put things on an action list because their reference isn't within arm's reach somehow. And I'm not sure what the digital version of that would be, but if reference is too far out of reach, does that lead them to not file in reference, but instead consider it actionable when it isn't really actionable? So curious if anybody wants to say anything about that in the questions box, dive right in. And in the meantime, back to what you were saying, Meg.
Yeah, and I think that, again, you need to have as many reference systems as you need. So I have like references, just general reference, and I actually combine personal and professional. You can have it separated if you want. I like to have my financial reference separate because usually when I'm working on finances, I just want to go into that section. And I actually have clients reference because I have so many clients that's just alphabetized. I'm a big gardener, and so I have a whole filing drawer on gardening because I didn't necessarily, so a kind of a topic, if you kind of have a lot on a topic, a lot of times that warrants having its own section. And people are like, but it can't go in both places. So I can't say, oh, well, this could go into gardening or finances. You have to have really clean edges to that. And then again, Kelly Forrester chimed in and said that be kind to your future self actually came from Robert Peake, who used to work with the David Allen Company in IT. Mm-hmm. And I love it because I use that all the time, which is if I'm going to file this away, how the heck am I going to remember that it's there? Or is the world going to push me into it? So, for example, I have something on a washer and dryer, bought a washer and dryer. I made a file. You could make it called manuals. I call it washer and dryer. The washer and dryer busts, it's going to push me into those files. I don't have to remember it. The world is going to remind me, wow, you know, your dryer just busted, and I'll go into that file and remember it. But if you need to remember that reference and you need to be reminded to be pushed into that, then you have to have that in your system somewhere to remember that. So, you know, something to kind of think about when you're creating your reference systems.
And I think too, you know, to come back to the, you know, kind of the periodically going through it and culling it, like the question that was coming forward when you were talking is, you know, not so much what if I need it, but do I still need it? Because I might have needed something, you know, on June 1st, and, you know, by, you know, September 30th, it's like, no, I don't need this anymore. So, like, there's, like, you know, there's a great opportunity to kind of keep asking those questions, you know, because, you know, I'd say most things, like, you know, a manual for your washer and dryer, yeah, you might have that for 10 years because, you know, that's the shelf life of it, but something else might have a 3-month shelf life. And there's no use clogging up our reference with stuff that we just don't need anymore.
And that gets back to what you were saying about building in time every 6 months, 1 year, whatever your timing is on that, to go back and review what's in there, clear out any dead wood and keep it fresh.
Yeah, one other thing I think, because I guess we're getting a little bit into organizing, but it still gets into trusting it, which is I have clients, particularly with email folders, they'll just make one honker folder called 2015. They're so good at searching, they'll just put everything in there. Mm-hmm. I am lousy at searching, and I actually don't have any resistance to take an email and make its own folder. And so this is where it gets into know thyself. Know how good you are at retrieving information. Know how techie you are, because everybody's really different. One person said that, yeah, he was a little too techie and made it more complicated. And again, David says you got to be able to manage your system when you have the flu. And you've got to get really clear on the meaning of your reference and the purpose of why you're keeping it, so that it doesn't have a piece of you, and you won't have any resistance to keep that and manage that.
And I just want to answer a quick question from Francesca, because she's asking, you know, I have a doubt, should I have to review them? And it's not so much that you have to review them, but it's just good periodically to go through it to see if you still need it, to see if that reference is still relevant in your world, or if it's something that's kind of outdated and you don't really need it anymore. Because it just kind of plugs up your system, you know, if you're just hanging on to stuff that you don't need anymore.
Yeah, like electronics, like I was cleaning up
the
one time.
BlackBerry manual.
The Palm and the BlackBerry. I'm like, I don't think I need this anymore. Or the old phone. And I do that. No, I do that. I have kept, because I have a child, and if she loses her phone, she's going back to the old phone. So again, there's like a purpose, because I told her, it's like, you lose this phone, I'm not replacing it, you're going back to your old phone. And so
your
I
reference
have
folder,
it.
your reference folder for the old phone is kind of like the backup that makes her know that you're serious about taking care of the new phone.
Yeah, and I've kept it because of that reason. But you see, you guys, I do that with everything. What is the purpose of me keeping something that's really outdated? And it's because I got this agreement with my kid. I'll buy you this really nice phone, but if something happens to it, you're going back to this old phone, and that's why I've kept it. So there's always this relationship in this conversation with any of that, because otherwise that creates drag.
Meanwhile, Meg, you have the most responsible child on the planet. That's hilarious.
I know. I crack the screen more than she does.
Like, what's really happening?
One thing I wanted to mention, you were talking about one big honker folder for, say, 2014 versus a folder for a single email, that kind of thing. I've heard people talking about a shift toward just one big bucket to store things because digital search, makes everything so easy that there's no reason to spend the time organizing more than just in one big bucket. I'm interested to hear what you two have to say about this, because in my experience, there's a bit of a trap there, because if I tell myself that I can always find it through digital search, I'm also telling myself that I know what keywords to search on, and I'm sure that the keyword is in, say, the document or the email that I've stored there. What I've run into is that I don't always have the keyword I think will be there, and I end up spending more time searching than if I had just made a more granular level of folder or storage for that reference item. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how granular to go?
Just that. If I was coaching you, John, and you had some experiences where you couldn't find the keyword, then I would say no. You might have like a little bit of a combination, but I really have clients that never have that issue. They are so phenomenal at searching that I actually will slow them down if I try to get them to parcel it out into folders, except project support.
Okay.
They will create a folder called project support, and then if there are emails that have to do with a particular project, they'll name the email folder what that project is, and they'll nest it under project support. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they might have meetings, or maybe they have direct reports and they have information for that. So it's not like they will have just one. They may parcel out some other folders depending on their job and responsibilities and how frequently they're in those folders. Mm-hmm. But I will do a lot of probing to be able to say, you need to have no resistance, you need to trust this 100%, it can't break down, you can't be spending. I had a coaching, and this is really true. We started at 8 o'clock, and we did not start our coaching till 11 o'clock because he was spending 3 hours looking for these decks that he needed for a presentation the next day. Oh. And so 3 hours, I kid you not. Oh. And we kind of would start, and then he couldn't find it, and I was just, and the whole coaching was about how to file and retrieve. It was I've never had a coaching like that, and we had to go through all the folders, we had to rename them, he had to, so that he didn't have that problem anymore, and he did it. And then I came back and did more coaching with him. I've never seen such an extreme example of that. I mean, that really was the most extreme. Wow. Where it's like the whole thing was about, you need to be able to know how to file something away, paper and emails, and retrieve it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always on the back end. How easy can you find something? Filing is two things: easy filing on the front end, easy retrieval on the back end. And how that looks is, it could be different for each person. Mm. But you don't want to be unconscious in the clarifying and organizing. So some clients, they just kind of toss something into a digital file and like hope and pray that like the search feature is going to work. It's like that to me is going to create open loops. Mm-hmm. That's not a trusted system.
And you know how we also talk about slowing down to speed up? So let's say that you have a folder on a project, and you have a lot of decks, and you have a lot of versions of that deck. you know, what people don't do is they go into that folder and then they'll see the name of that deck, you know, workflow coaching training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, you're on version 20 and you need to find version 15 and you didn't slow it down and name it and file it so that you could retrieve it. And that's what I see a lot in coaching. I can't tell you how many times you go into a folder and it's the same subject line over and over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving too fast, and now they're spending 10, 15, 20 minutes trying to find that one particular email with that one particular thread. And a lot of tools, you actually can name the subject line or rename the subject line before you file it away. In Outlook, you can actually type over the subject line and file it away.
Yeah.
In Lotus Notes, you can edit it. Now, and some you can't, but boy, if you can't, you've got to like figure out a way if it's the same subject line, and then you don't have to keep all those emails. You know, you just need to keep the last one so that you can retrieve it. But people are moving too fast.
Yeah.
And I think that slow and strategic really, really helps, again, on that back end when you need to retrieve it. And I think that, again, I just see people moving too fast. They're like, oh, yeah, you know, just file it away, because I got other stuff to do. And it doesn't save you time, you know, moving forward.
Yeah, if it takes me more than 30 seconds to find something, I have an improvement opportunity with my reference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, it's like if I feel that frustration coming up when I can't find something, that means it's like, okay, Julie, you know, what's the improvement opportunity there on the front end?
Good tips. All right, well, let's move on to example number 3, which is someday maybe. And our quote for that is, someday maybes are not throwaway items. They may be some of the most interesting and creative things you'll ever get involved with. All right.
Well, I'm going to cue this up, and Meg, I'm going to let you take it because I just love, you know, when we were prepping for this, Meg was really talking about like how the someday maybe list is. I forget how you said it, Meg. It was like this is like the most important list to maintain, I think, and I really hadn't really thought about that way, and I love that. So I'd love for you to just share about that because it was just really powerful for me.
I find it the most underutilized list, and I find it the most underutilized, and I find it's the list that people trust the least.
Yeah.
Because I think everybody has a different relationship with someday maybe. I mean, David doesn't have any issues incubating a project that he's going to do in a couple of months and put that on a someday maybe list, or I want to travel around the world and have those two mixed. And ideas, you know, I had a client, like probably a decade ago, who had a consultant who said to him, "You have too many ideas and you need to stop." And I think the consultant, one of the things I think that is so phenomenal about GTD is we can handle volume. You can throw any kind of volume at us in coaching, and we have a framework for it. Well, this consultant could not handle that framework of the volume that he had. So his solution was, well, you just need to not have so many ideas. And
so instead of your mind is for having ideas, not holding them, this consultant was saying, your mind shouldn't have so many ideas. It's because it should be holding them.
Exactly. So I said, no, you can have as many ideas as you want. Capture them all. If you have hundreds of ideas a day and you're an inventor or you're in marketing or sales and you come up with these incredible ideas, and our former IT person would come up with thousands of ideas to do with David, with the David Allen Company. But he put it all in his agendas list. And when I coached him, I'm like, no, agendas are for new things you want to talk to David about, but you get together with him once a year. So capture all of those someday maybes, and then he and David used to get together once a year and like go through 1,500 things during the day about the cool stuff that they could work on. So our IT person had the freedom to capture all of those really cool things, but he had to manage his someday maybe list. And we have databases at the David Allen Company. You know, we have someday maybes on different kinds of products or ideas that we have that we've been capturing those things for over a decade or 15 years, but it's all in a database. It's not on a little list. I mean, you get bottleneck here. So if you have some volume on a someday maybe, that's okay, you know, but you got to manage it. You got to know how often you need to review it. Keep a someday maybe list that you do want to review in the weekly review. That's kind of important. But then there are other someday maybes that you want to review weekly or monthly or quarterly or yearly or every 5 years or whatever you need to, and it can be by topic. And that's really kind of okay. But if you do not trust your incubation list or your someday maybe list, you're going to junk up your task list and you're going to say, well, but I may need it, so I'm going to keep it on my calls list. Or I may have to do this project, and you keep it on your project list, and that's going to muckety-muck your whole system.
Yeah, I had a client recently where I had done this before, but I hadn't done it in a really long time, where we moved everything in her action list, and I mean everything, to someday maybe, and then we cherry picked it back onto action, and it was really, really powerful to see how
that's a radical approach.
it was radical. It was radical. I was sweating a little there. It was a little intense, but it was actually really powerful because it really, at the end of that coaching, she had this beautiful action and project list that she was excited about, and she had this beautiful someday maybe list that she was excited about. There was a clear line drawn in the sand, we review built into her schedule moving forward, and it was really, kind of an optimal state, where, trusting kind of like the calibration that she had in terms of what she could commit to, and then really trusting this giant someday maybe list is only going to grow, and a way to organize it and keep it in a way that it feels safe. Like she felt safe at the end of that work. She had these great precious ideas. There's a great place to park them. She knows how often she needs to review it. So yeah, you never want to clip someone's wings in terms of idea generation. Like that's the whole point of GTD, to have the freedom to do that. But to have the freedom to do that, you have to have a place to store it so that it feels like, it's not out of sight, out of mind in this black hole somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Hearing you describe that, it makes me think that someday maybe isn't really a trusted list. Then the action lists become the sort of committed to lists instead of the really committed to lists.
Yep. It's so true.
Yeah, and you have to have as many someday maybe lists as you need to. And I think that everybody has a different relationship with someday maybe. And I want to kind of put something out there because I think that there's a group of people that need an intermittent list between their projects and actions list and their someday maybe list, which is called an incubation list. And I'm actually one of those people, which is, I don't know what I want to do with this. I don't know if it's a current project or a current action. I don't know if it's an agenda yet. I really don't know what it is. My brain still needs to mull it over, and I'm not avoiding making a decision. It's not a procrastination. It literally is I need to incubate it. And it's not even I need to think about it or I need to make a decision, because that's not finishing your thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I actually have an incubation list, and I will review it, frequently to be able to say, now I know what to do with it. Now it is really a someday maybe. Or, no, I really want to move forward with this with John. And I was working with a client who had an email in his inbox for like 2 months. And everything else was current, but this one email. So he drove to zero.
There's a sign if there ever was.
I love it. There's one email that was like 2 months old. And I was just like, well, what's going on with this? And he goes, I don't want to do anything with that one because I know that if I talk to my boss about that one, it's going to create a lot of work for me, and I don't even want to touch that one. I said, well, but leaving it in your inbox and seeing it for the last 2 months, you've given it more energy than it really needs to. But he's like, he didn't want to forget about it, right? He may need it at some point. It was a good idea, but it completely freaked him out, and he didn't have the bandwidth or resources to move forward on it. But it also wasn't a someday maybe. He really needed to incubate it. And so we created an incubation email folder because he had more of those. Or you can have a list, I use a paper-based planner, and I actually have a tab called Incubate. And you can't just let it sit there. I mean, you have to keep it active, and you have to look at it. And it's not an inbox. It literally is, and I'm telling you, I bet there's some participants, some GTD Connect members, because if this makes no sense to you, then it's not for you. This tip is not for you. If you're kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about, Meg. But there's another group of people that comes up in coaching, which is like, that's a missing piece for me.
Yeah. And I bet one of the clues for that, for those of you who are listening is if you look at your inbox and you're generally good at getting inbox to zero, but once in a while something sticks in there and ages for a few days, a couple of weeks, that's probably a clue that you might be able to use some sort of an intermediate incubate bucket like Meg's talking about.
And I'll go into it and say, can I make a decision? Can I move this out into my GTD system? And then inevitably it always happens. It's like, yep, I haven't dropped any balls, nothing, no one's been hurt or anything like this. And so he did that, and then I did a follow-up call with him, I think 2 days ago. And I was like, well, so how's that incubation going? He's like, it's working. You know, it is. I may need it. You know, I haven't made that decision. So do it as you will with it, but it is something that I find there's a small group of GTDers that really need to have that incubation to add to make the Someday Maybe list useful.
Yeah, and I would guess that a key for that, if you're going to use it, tell me if this fits, Meg, for your coaching clients, is that they get really clear about how often they need to look at that.
Yes, because a lot of times I'll put things in the morning, and I'll come back in the afternoon because we have some guidelines about when we get back to coworkers and clients. So I can't, if a client asks me to do something, I'm not going to incubate it for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I'll send them an email back and say, or even to a coworker, I got it. I need to mull it over. And I don't even think, it's not like I have to think about it. I need to mull it over. And I've had conversations with David about this, about, well, is that another version of procrastination? It's like, no, I will make a decision on it, but there's depth and nuance, and I need time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there are a group of people that need a little bit more time to make decisions than doing the workflow diagram there. So kind of to be continued there, but it's another thing that can get in the way from really trusting your Someday Maybe list.
Very helpful. Let's see what's next here. I notice we're coming up toward the top of the hour, and I want to make sure we finish on time. So the other thing we wanted to bring up is one way of looking at all these is to filter them through your higher horizons. And the quote we have for that is, if you're not totally sure what your job is, it will always feel overwhelming.
I'm going to jump in because I only have 5 more minutes. I'd love to maybe like an independent survey, because if this is really fun and interesting for folks, I think, Meg, you and I could do a whole webinar on this, just this piece alone in terms of making decisions based on those higher, like what if I need it, like based on, clarifying my higher horizons of focus and my roles. And, we had a lot of rich conversations around this, but that really is really impactful. It's like, if I don't really know what my roles are, if I don't know what my responsibilities are, down on the runway, what if I need it plays out in a really big way. Meg, you want to?
Well, I'll give you a couple of personal examples that I was talking with Julie and John yesterday, because when we were talking about this, for those of you who know, I have a 92-year-old dad. He was 91, but now he's 92. And there are 4 girls in the family, and we each hold certain roles with my dad. And I was up there last weekend, and my father was like, here! And I was just like, not me, goes to Sally. I don't need this. This is not for me, because I don't hold the role. I don't hold this financial role. So if I wasn't clear on the role, I could have taken it, and it was like, oh, maybe I need it, maybe I don't. But I don't hold the role, so I don't necessarily need that. Yeah. I took my kid up into the attic last night, and we were going through art stuff. She's 16. She's going to be a senior in high school, and I'm like, you know what? We're schlepping through your art stuff, and might we need it? Might we not need it? And we're doing it through kind of our roles, and I just wanted to leave you with, same with your read and review. If you're in a job where you need to stay on top of professional development, you better really carve out that time. You may need to do a higher level review to make room for the read and review, to make room for reference, to make room for your Someday Maybes, given your roles. So we want you just to kind of think about that as a way of making decisions, of filtering things. We thought, well, do we start with this or do we end with this? But we really wanted to end this webinar with this conversation and kind of to be continued, but we wanted to get you thinking in this webinar about these areas, but through your horizons of focus.
We've got a couple of questions to finish up with. What's your biggest takeaway from today? And are there any next actions for you based on what you learned here today? So feel free to put that in the questions box or put it in your incubate file or however that works for you, but we wanted to at least get you to think about a takeaway from today, anything that that you can change in the way you're doing your clarifying when you're going through your inputs. I think that's about it. Anything else you and Julie and Meg want to say to finish up for today?
You know, it's always so much fun to play with you guys. I hope this is value for people. And, you know, this is such a rich topic. I really feel like I was like watching the clock like, oh my gosh, like we could keep going for at least another hour on it because there's such good stuff in here. So maybe we'll have a to be continued.
I echo that with Julie. It's always lovely. I really so appreciate the GTD Connect members. I love your questions, your participation. I love you really wanting to take a deeper dive. There's so much richness here about really paying attention to what has your attention. And yet, one of the things I think is so fabulous about this methodology is really identifying what your drag is and what has your attention. To the detailed level of an article that's been sitting, you know, next to you for a year. I mean, I see that stuff in those piles and reference and the someday maybes, and that is so much drag, and the freedom you have. So I really hope that you take the opportunity to either identify maybe a little project if you have more than a couple of actions that you've taken from the seminar. Make a project out of it. You know, grab some project planning, spend some time really identifying all of the things that you would need to do to check this project off as done. And, you know, take your practice to another level. And this never goes away. You know, it's always about, okay, so once you do this, then there's another cut and another cut and another cut. And what's so wonderful about GTD Connect members is that you want to play with us in that level. And that's what's just so wonderful about the community. So really appreciate you guys and really appreciate Julie and John, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Had a lot of fun here.
Thanks, John.
Thanks you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.